The Russia-Ukraine conflict could lead to World War III. That is the president's stance and his chief argument for why Ukraine should simply give Russia everything it wants. But is the reality that a Russian victory in Ukraine would actually destabilize the world, and that is going to cause World War III. And the only path to peace might just be a Russian defeat. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. I want to talk about what I think is the underreported grim reality of President Trump's so-called peace efforts in Ukraine. Now, what I want you guys to understand is that the president has essentially made the argument that Ukraine is disposable on the world stage, right? And Eastern Ukraine being surrendered to Russia, despite most NATO countries protesting and actively equipping Ukraine against it, is of trivial importance, because to the president, he says we have to do what we can to prevent World War III. But here, I want you guys to join me in sort of looking at the world through the lens of the authoritarian axis that has emerged from this conflict. Russia under Vladimir Putin, China under Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un's North Korea. And when we look at the world from their perspectives, we're going to see that a Russian victory is going to be the green light to launch a massive takeover of globally contested territories. So let's start with the perspective of Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping represents and leads the second largest economy on the globe. China's economy is larger than that of Europe combined. It is only larger than that, or it is only subordinate to the United States, and then only barely. And critically, the United States has a service economy, one that produces things like software and highly capable people, and technology companies like Google or Palantir. China, by contrast, makes a lot of stuff. And these are two equally large economies that do very different things. And the problem is that for China, they are, in fact, the engine that is equipping, in many cases, the Russian military. Their production abilities have been essential to the Russian war machine, particularly in the areas of drones, ranging from low-tech to super high-tech drones. But if you're China, you have a problem. Despite being a huge economic superpower, you have to, one, continue to deliver growth to your people, right? Because they don't have democratic freedoms, the people of China can't change their leadership. There is instead kind of a mandate from heaven, a cultural agreement that says that in exchange for diminished personal freedoms, something that, to be clear, China in its entire history has never had in the Western sense. But that agreement holds that the ruling CCP has to continue to deliver wealth and prosperity. And the problem is, of course, China hasn't been doing that. We've seen that China has struggled with a deflationary economy, one in which prices keep getting lower, which of course, is what's called a deflationary spiral, in which why would you buy an apple today when the apple will be cheaper tomorrow? Why would you buy a house today when that house will be cheaper tomorrow? But what that means is, why would you buy stocks today? Why would you invest in a company when it's going to be cheaper to do so tomorrow? And that creates a downward spiral in the Chinese economy. So right now, you're Xi Jinping. You have a country that's too old, that an economy that is too moribund, that is too stagnant, right? And you also have a lack of international prestige. So where are you going to get both the resources to expand and increase your economic viability, right? And the answer is a list of territorial disputes, other countries where China claims that they own portions of the territory. But the largest by far is Taiwan, is the island of Taiwan. And this is a independent country in all but name, right? China, of course, China claims that it is a breakaway province that China has always had the right to annex. And that language is actually very reminiscent of Vladimir Putin's claims on Ukraine, where he says, actually, Ukraine is a part of Russia. It is historically Russian and populated by Russian peoples who just have these pesky ideas of independence, but they don't know what they really want. And that's one of the reasons I think China finds a natural partner in Russia, because they can mutually support each other's claims on other countries' sovereign territory based on sort of vague historical wrongs. And Taiwan is also an economic superpower, home, of course, of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, a massive global manufacturer of chips, something that is exponentially more important as the world becomes an AI economy. And so, but remember, that's not the only claim that China has. They claim to own the Paracel Islands claimed by Vietnam, and occupied by China. A number of different claims within the South China Sea, Paracels, as well as the Spratlys or Senkaku Islands. They have claims on parts of India where there's been ongoing border disputes. They have claims on parts of Bhutan. So China has a lot of territory that it believes it is entitled to. And so if you're Xi Jinping, right, one of the things he has explicitly instructed his military, he has said to them, military, I expect you to be able to, on my order, invade Taiwan by 2027, right? I want to have that tool in my pocket the day on January 1st, 2027. I'm not saying I'm going to use it, but you have to be ready to execute on order. And that, of course, requires a lot of work from the Chinese military. But it is a sign that Xi Jinping isn't thinking about it, he's not toying with it, and he's not blustering about it. He plans on doing it, right? He wants a military that expressly is able to annex Taiwan. And if his military can annex Taiwan successfully, there is nothing that will stop them from annexing the Spratlys, the Paracels, taking from Japan, taking from Vietnam, taking from all of these other countries in the South China Sea. And if you're Xi Jinping, right, this is where this ties back in to Russia and Ukraine. The reason is because what keeps Xi Jinping up at night is that he isn't going to face just the Taiwanese military, which is committed, but also trained, equipped, and supported by the United States. He's going to have to fight the U.S. military itself, at least in his current calculation. And that is troubling because, one, the Taiwanese military is trained by the U.S. military, and they share similar doctrinal outlooks. In contrast, the Chinese military follows a Soviet-style system, one that is mirrored in some ways by the Russian military. And so again, you have, a natural cooperation between Russia and China, where their militaries come from similar doctrinal backgrounds. But here's the real rub for Xi Jinping. Nobody on planet Earth has ever figured out a way to beat a NATO-trained and equipped force. Right? Every time in a conventional state-on-state battle, NATO doctrine wipes the floor with whoever is standing against them. And partially that's true because NATO, right, brings a lot of resources to any fight. And even if their tactics have flaws, the fact is that a military, like, for example, the Iraqi military in 2003 or 1991, simply was unable to resist the high-tech, fast-paced information war that the NATO forces brought to bear. But if Russia emerges victorious in Ukraine, something really, really important will have happened. The first time NATO equipment and a NATO force will lose a conventional conflict. And that means that the Russian military will have done something and built something very, very unique. A military force, a series of tactics, techniques, and strategies that can defeat a NATO military. Now, admittedly, the Ukrainians are not a first-rate NATO military. They've been receiving much of that aid they've been receiving is essentially old equipment, old Abrams, right? Third or fourth generation old Abrams, the HIMARS, right? That famously struck Russian targets. Russia actually took pictures of the debris and it was found to have been manufactured in 1990. So this is the old stuff in the back of our pantry that we gave to Ukraine. But in a way, that may have actually enabled the Russian military to evolve. It's one of the things that we've talked about on this channel a lot, is that over the course of 3 years, the Biden administration steadily increased aid to Ukraine and enabled them to use more and more Western tools, but only in response to Russian escalation. And so that meant that Putin essentially got to choose when the U.S. military would give the next tool to the Russians. And like a disease becoming resistant to each antibiotic you give them, as long as you make sure you underdose that antibiotic, the Russian military would encounter a new piece of Western tech. They would evolve their tactics to counter it, and then the U.S. would release the next phase of the technology. So cluster bombs are a great example. These were very dangerous munitions that really caused a lot of problems for advancing Russian infantry. Russia evolved their tactics, going from 12 to 30-man assaults to simply 3- and 4-man teams scattered throughout, so that even if you dropped a cluster munition in a huge area, you would destroy at most 3 to 4 soldiers. Simply a waste of munitions. And these kind of tactics have evolved and evolved and evolved. And so what you have now is a Russian military that has evolved into something so tailored to beating Western and NATO equipment in a ground fight. And so you're Xi Jinping, and you have already established the ability to equip the Russian military, right? The Russian military's weapons, their body armor, their drones, all of this is manufactured in China, right? Everything that is non-lethal. But remember, much of the Russian military's lethal equipment is coming from North Korea, a Russian vassal state. And so if you are China, you're looking around saying, well, I'm friendly with the Russians who have establish these tactics. I am the provider of non-lethal military gear. My subordinate state, North Korea, provides the military equipment, and we are the manufacturing superpower of the globe. So we have all the building blocks to build a military capable of defeating the West. And here's where things get even crazier. You may remember that Russia's military recruitment strategy looks nothing like a NATO recruitment strategy, right? Who joins a Western military? 18 to 20-year-olds. They're young, they're in shape, and they are open to being instilled with a military and martial culture that they can then carry on through their military career. Russia has a totally different playbook. They recruit men at the end of their working lives, men between 50 and 60, right? These are often men who, and there's a brilliance to Putin's decision to do this. And it's because if you look at the cost benefit over the lifespan of a human being in any country, but in Russia, China, developed country, you see that between the ages of 0 and 18, a boy, essentially, is a drain on the state's resources, right? They have to go to public school, but they do not work and pay taxes to pay their way through public school. But they also, of course, are born in a hospital that costs the state money. They are they consume state resources as part of medical care, etc. And then when they're 18, though, the switch flips. They begin to work. They earn money. They provide economic value. And the state takes some of that in the form of taxation. They become literally productive members of society. And after a few years of working, they are able to essentially pay back or contribute more in taxes to society than was drawn by their childhood. And then, of course, you have their working life in which they contribute in a positive way into the fiscal balance of a country. But then something happens in Russia. This is going to happen around 50 years old. In a country like China, it happens more around 65 because of Russia's notoriously low life expectancy for men and high levels of alcoholism. Around 55, a lot of Russian men begin to slow their working life. They become less productive, and they begin to draw things like their pension, a working pension, their version of Social Security. But they also are more likely to seek and require medical treatment. And so what you do is around 55, the net value of a Russian man actually turns negative. So Russia has said, listen, why don't we save a little money and you get to earn a little money? They say you're a 55-year-old man. You basically have 2 arms, 2 legs, and are capable of walking. So what we're going to do is instead of paying, let's say, $1 million between now and the end of your life, right? That's what the state is going to cost you. They say right now, we'll give you a one-time payment of $500,000 and you will go fight for the Russian military in Ukraine. Will you die? Almost certainly. But in exchange, right, your family will get a one-time check and the state isn't going to have to worry about paying for your care into old age because you won't make it that long. And this is actually kind of brilliant because you notice that Russia has a demographic crisis, but you know who is done having all the kids they're going to have? Men in their 50s. In fact, if a man doesn't have any kids by the time he's in his 50s, it's basically a statistical certainty that he's not going to have any subsequent children, right? The exceptions to that rule are few and far between. And so if you are a country like China, you have that same problem exacerbated. China has an aging population, and it is going to become more and more difficult for China to support them because they have fewer and fewer young working adults, right? And these people in their 70s, right, they are increasingly going to be a drain on Chinese resources, right? They are not working in a lot of cases, and they are increasingly turning to things like nursing homes, right, and other kind of care services that are provided by the government, right? In fact, they said China has 300 million people over 60, about 1/5 of their population, but by 2035, 1 in 3 Chinese is going to be over 60 years old. So you notice that right now, today, in order to prevent a massive economic blow up, China needs to find a way to attrition out a lot of these older aging adults. And so the Russian military tactic of having old men, not young men, fight their wars actually is an economic boon. It is a solution. Even if China were to lose, it would still solve one of Xi Jinping's biggest problems, or at least contribute towards solving it. But wait, it solves another Chinese problem. Remember, we talked about the Chinese deflation crisis. Well, how can you fight deflation? Well, one strategy is actually government spending. Russia has the exact opposite problem. They have a massive crisis in inflation. In fact, you know how the Fed has its interest rate way too high to fight inflation at a blistering like 5.5% or 6%? Yeah, the Russian inflation rate, 21%. And basically, it should be higher, but Vladimir Putin has almost certainly instructed the central bank to keep the rate no higher than 21%. And that's to ensure that businesses can continue to get loans to fund their operations. But all across Russia, there's a massive inflationary crisis, a cost of living crisis. But for someone like Xi Jinping's China, for someone like Xi Jinping in China, he looks at an inflation crisis. It's sort of like looking at your neighbor's house that's burning down while your house, you have broken heat and you're freezing to death, right? China goes, I would love to find a way to get a little fire going in my house. And I would love to have a problem where the fire is too hot, it's too warm. So Xi Jinping looks at this tactic, these strategies with the Russian military, and says, man, even if we lost the war, losing that war would solve so many problems. And this is but ultimately, losing a war is still politically devastating for the credibility of a country, right? And look no further, again, than the latest U.S. election in which the Biden administration, who famously botched and surrendered essentially the entire country of Afghanistan to the Taliban, and I understand that it was implementing a peace deal negotiated by the Trump administration, but the reality is that the actual war was lost by Biden, and he lost the election, or rather his designated successor did. So China still says we can't pick a fight we can't win, right? So we need to maintain our state credibility. And so they are probably looking and saying, if Russia can pull out a W, if they can achieve their fundamental geopolitical objectives, which is cleaving off a portion of Ukraine and forcing NATO to end their open door policy, reversing 50 to 70 years of set policy within NATO, right? Literally, it would require NATO lining out key parts of its treaty. What you have instead, right? What you would have is for Xi Jinping to say, we can do this. It will help our economy. It will aid our ability, and we're going to win. We think we can win. And the fact is that this, when you combine this reality with many of the statements made by the Trump administration, where they've said, for example, Elon just tweeted that NATO is a waste of time, that defending our allies who don't contribute anything is a total waste. And this is a massive, massive problem because Taiwan has a NATO-like agreement. In fact, Taiwan, Japan, these countries have NATO-like agreements with each other that we will collectively back each other up in the event of an attack by a third party. And the fact that the U.S. has never been less credible, right? The fact that the U.S. has never appeared less willing to defend its allies is an invitation to say, listen, this is the moment. The door is unlocked. We've left our door unlocked, Xi Jinping. We know you've been watching our house. You've wanted to break in and annex our friend Taiwan. You want to take over our living room, right? And Xi Jinping goes, guys, the U.S. has stopped locking their door. We don't know when they're going to figure out, right? A new administration might come in. They might say something very different. They might start locking their doors again and say, no, our allies are ironclad. An attack on one is an attack on all. This principle is absolutely enforced. They're going to say, listen, we should do this before the U.S. figures out that NATO and its collective allies matter. And so Xi Jinping is looking, and he's probably saying, listen, this is our moment. And the fact that Russia is also going to owe Xi Jinping a favor because of their extensive support, that in fact, many Chinese banks were cut off from the rest of the global economy because they supported Russia. So Russia has to maintain its international credibility, they have to back up China in the face of their own conflict if they need assistance. But that's not all. Because remember, China isn't alone. It's not just China that has these desires. China's little brother, North Korea. In fact, in December 2023, around the time that North Korea and Russia signed their extensive partnership, which led to not just North Korean military equipment and munitions being sold or given potentially to Russia, and North Korean troops being sent to Russia to fight in Ukraine, the North Koreans, after decades of essentially what they said was a goal of peaceful reunification. Both sides said, listen, we're not going to say who should be in charge of a unified Korea, but we both agree it shouldn't happen in a war, right? They've said we maintain big militaries only as deterrence as a function of peace. But now, in December 2023, North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un said there was going to be a fundamental turnaround in North Korea's stance toward the South. He said the South is actually our enemy. He said the party, this is his, essentially, the North Korean Communist Party's comprehensive conclusion after reviewing decades-long inter-Korean relations that the reunification can never be achieved with these Republic of Korea, South Korean riffraffs that define the unification by absorption and unification under liberal democracy as their state policy, which he said is in sharp contrast with our unification, which is one nation, one state, two systems. And of course, he says that because, he would love to keep he would love to dominate the South Korean market economy and extract all of the value while remaining, of course, a dictator in the North. But the most important thing to take away from this is that Kim Jong-un has said, peace is now off the table. We are going to be in charge of the South. The South is the enemy of North Korea. And this is a huge problem because, again, he has the same problem. In fact, Trump has come out and said that he thinks defending South Korea is kind of a waste, right? And as they've said, the Trump administration hopes to focus on U.S.-China strategic competition and wants South Korea and Japan and many others to pay more, right? In fact, Trump says, I think we should send South Korea a $10 billion bill for defense cost sharing. And if you're Kim Jong-un and you say, wow, the South's biggest ally has said they are only going to defend them if they cough up money. And they've shown that they are willing to do this, willing to stop cooperation unless the host country pays a bill. And remember, Ukraine has 3 years of U.S. support. South Korea has received 50, 60 years of U.S. military support. And so if you're the Trump administration, $10 billion is not even close to the bill you're going to pay. They are likely going to be expected, if you're based on sort of Trump math, they're going to be expected to pay something in the magnitude of potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. And so if you're Kim Jong-un, you are likely looking at you're looking at this too as the window in which the door is unlocked. You now more than ever have a military that is combat experienced, that has learned from the Russian victory, not victory. It won't be victory. If Russia annexes Ukraine successfully and Ukraine is not a NATO member, Russia will have won that war. And so if you look at it and you say, listen, we have brigades of soldiers trained to beat NATO. We're going to retool our military and we are going to go after the South Koreans because we suspect that the U.S. will not be willing to defend them. And you notice that in order to achieve both of these countries, there is a strategic advantage to engaging in these invasions simultaneously because the U.S. already is unwilling to spend. They're already cutting their defense budget and they are going to be divided between two allies where the official administration policy is that I don't want to support them. Anyway, guys, that is just what I want you guys to understand about the potential for a second world war, or a third world war, emerging from a Russian victory in Ukraine, right? As I always tell people, this isn't a prelude to World War III. It might be, history might consider this the start of World War III. The question is just who is going to win, the world of freedom and democracy or the world of dictatorships and autocracy. Anyway, thank you guys. Thanks to all the Colonel tier members at Combat Vet News like Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M. Ida Skycall. All of our Lieutenant tier members couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.